Operation Absolute Resolve was a meticulously planned raid involving 150 aircraft operating from 20 different US bases and Navy ships. Sequential strikes on radar and defence sites before Delta Force commandos seized Venezuela's president. Swift, precise, almost flawless. The Trump administration may not have put so much planning into what happens next. Or at least, it gives that impression.
Thank you very much. We're going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. The people that are standing right behind me, we're going to be running it.
Who are those people who will be running the country specifically?
So it's not running, it's running policy. The policy with regards to this.
Really, since the beginning of the administration, people have been speculating, some publicly, but most privately, as to when we would move against Venezuela. So this did not come as a surprise. It wasn't a shock to people who pay attention. The shock is that now, apparently, we're in charge of 30 million people in a country that is well larger than California.
If Nicolas Maduro had always been in Trump's crosshairs, at times the leader seemed to revel in the attention.
Soy más famoso que Taylor Swift en Estados Unidos ahorita. Que Karol G. Soy más famoso que Bad Bunny.
Inside Venezuela, the capture of Maduro was met, at first, with disbelief. The US raid came shortly after the nation's equivalent of April Fool's, St. Innocents Day.
It's actually the typical joke that you would make on St. Innocents Day. Oh, you know, Maduro fell, turn on the TV. And people are like, I'm not going to fall for that.
But Maduro's government remains intact.
It's the same Chavista troops, it's the same Chavista government. It's just that Maduro's not there. So people in Venezuela, I mean, there have been some scattered celebrations, but a lot of people are just afraid to celebrate.
Adding to the confusion, Trump has not encouraged Venezuela's opposition or endorsed its leader, last year's Nobel Peace Prize recipient, Maria Corina Machado.
She doesn't have the support within or the respect within the country.
The opposition claimed it won elections held in 2024, but Maduro refused to cede power.
It is very concerning that the Trump administration is not putting the opposition and the sort of the will of the Venezuelan people first. Right now, what's being put first, at least in terms of the objective or the goal of post-Maduro Venezuela, is oil.
We're going to have our very large United States oil companies, the biggest anywhere in the world, go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken infrastructure, the oil infrastructure, and start making money for the country.
Venezuela has vast oil reserves, with around 300 billion barrels in the ground, more than Saudi Arabia. But the nation remains poor, in part because the oil is largely untapped.
I mean, Venezuela was producing 3 million barrels when Chavez came to power. It's now producing 800, 900,000 barrels. It can easily go up at least to 2.5 million barrels in 3 to 5 years. If you do that, then the economy will boom.
The president says he targeted Maduro because he allows the export of drugs into the US, and partly because of historic grievances over its oil reserves.
We're going to take back the oil that, frankly, we should have taken back a long time ago.
US oil companies did lose contracts under former Venezuelan leader Hugo Chavez in 2007. But those disputes were fought out in international arbitration.
So what did Venezuela do after that? It started paying. Venezuela was paying the companies up until the end of 2018. Why did it stop in 2019? Because the US government imposed sanctions on it.
US political analyst Larry Sabato says Trump's motivation to capture Maduro may be much closer to home.
Why did he do it? Well, for one thing, Marco Rubio is Secretary of State, and this has been Marco Rubio's cause for many years during his entire time in the Senate, really. The Venezuelans are an important part of his base in Florida and helped him to win all of his Senate races there. And he feels very strongly about it for lots of different reasons. He thinks it's going to lead to a takeover by the United States in Cuba, which is where people need to be watching next.
Are you considering U.S. action in Cuba?
We're not. I think it's just going to fall. I don't think we need any action. It looks like it's going down.
Trump's former MAGA ally, Marjorie Taylor Greene, says the president is abandoning his supporters.
They voted to tear down the system that protects the rich, powerful elites. They voted to tear down the system that consistently goes for foreign wars and regime change. They voted to tear down the system that does nothing for regular, hardworking Americans.
Sabato says Trump's MAGA base will stick with him, despite the contradictions with his America First promises. He's in more trouble with the political centre.
People are not happy about this, and it isn't just because of what Trump said about running Venezuela. It's also because we now know enough about Donald Trump and his family and his billionaire buddies to know that there are going to be all kinds of money-making deals for them.
We need total access. We need access to the oil and to other things in their country that allow us to rebuild their country.
This afternoon, Vice President Delcy Rodriguez invited the US government to collaborate and cooperate with Venezuela. Maduro's successors must now balance America's demands with the challenges of running a weakened government.
It really has set up the current situation in Venezuela to lead to what usually happens in these situations, where you have a power vacuum with different factions of the leading regime vying for power, uncertainty, in terms of who will be in charge. And of course, that usually leads to a period of instability, violence, and just a lot of uncertainty.
Good night. Happy New Year.
It's not just Venezuela's Latin American neighbours who are now weighing the implications of this latest US military intervention. Scott Anderson is a former US diplomat and expert in international law and a fellow at the Brookings Institution. He joined me earlier from Washington. Scott Anderson, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
In your view, is the American intervention in Venezuela, including the extraction and arrest of its president, a breach of international law?
It really advances a view of international law that is very hard to reconcile either with how most countries view international law and how the United States has approached international law up to this point. That's not new necessarily. That was true of the maritime strikes the Trump administration has been pursuing as well. And I'm assuming that the legal theory for this action justifying international law is very similar to those. I think that's almost certainly correct. Although we actually haven't heard this administration put forward a straightforward international legal argument to date.
For want of a better explanation, we're hearing from the president that it was all an attempt to stop a narco-terrorist in the form of President Maduro. The narco-terrorism posed a direct threat to American national security. Therefore, the US had to go in. In international law terms, in your view as the expert, does that argument hold water?
I don't believe it does. International law under the UN Charter requires, before a state can use armed force against another state, it requires there to be an armed attack or an imminent threat of an armed attack. Now, the United States for a long time has taken a much broader view of what an armed attack is than a lot of other states. A lot of other states say it has to be pretty substantial scale and effects sort of violence. The United States has said really any sort of violence can work. But the United States has said in the context of cyber operations and other operations, things like economic sanctions, there has to be a kinetic effect. There has to be something that looks like the effects of a bomb or a bullet. That's what's missing here. They're linking narcotics trafficking and treating it as if it is a bomb or a bullet being hurled at the United States and at American nationals. And that is just a huge, huge leap. If you start saying that about narcotics trafficking, you can say that about all sorts of other activities, which it's always been understood was not supposed to be something that was supposed to give rise to the use of military force. Indeed, restricting the use of military force in response to those sorts of smaller incidents was what the UN Charter was all about. So it would be a pretty transformative change in understanding for the international system.
So you say it's a huge leap, an impossible leap when it comes to international law?
Impossible is hard to say, absolutely. There's a degree of innovation and advancing different views. Views do change, they do evolve in international law. What I would say, though, is that at times the United States and other states, when they've engaged in novel interpretations and applications of international law, they engage in international legal diplomacy to try and persuade other states of it. They make the argument saying, here's why we should be viewing this new activity through this existing lens of international law. Trump administration has not done that, or if it's trying, it's not doing it very effectively.
We have President Trump just in the last couple of hours now not ruling out military action in Colombia. Can we expect to see more of these type of actions by the Americans?
That's a good question, and I don't know, to be honest. The one thing I will note is that the Maduro case is a little bit of a strange case for the simple reason that Maduro was a genuine policy problem, and Venezuela is a genuine policy problem for the United States, for really the broader international community, certainly for many countries in the Western Hemisphere. And Maduro had taken on a weird significance for this administration. For months now, we've heard them say, we're going to force Maduro out of power. And it became a big political constraint for them. It became a commitment that they felt they needed to make good on. And that's the reporting we've come out today. In a New York Times report today, we heard a story that the Trump administration actually offered Maduro gilded exile in Turkey, but 2 or 3 weeks ago, saying you can leave the country and you can retire in luxury. When he declined to do that, when he's kind of publicly flaunting the fact that he was refusing to cooperate with the United States, that's what led to this operation. To me, that suggests that there's an element of this that might be primarily face-saving, a desire to achieve a victory that will allow them to then de-escalate potentially what has become a very costly and politically controversial here in the United States military campaign against narcotics traffickers and military buildup in the Caribbean. So it's possible this may be more of an off-ramp to further hostilities, whatever bluster we might be hearing from the administration. That said, we do have to wait and see. This administration has proven more willing to use military force than the first Trump administration. That is a trend I have no doubt will continue. I'm not sure that means, though, they're going to be willing to wage war over Greenland or Cuba or Colombia or any of the other targets that the president sometimes mentions in errant remarks.
What happens next is very interesting. We had the president talking about the US running Venezuela. The Secretary of State has walked that back a bit over the last 24 hours, but it's clear the US wants a pliant leader in Venezuela going forward. How do you see the governance of Venezuela now unfolding after what happened over the weekend?
In my mind, that's really the big question to look at moving forward, not least because the United States' position on this is really unclear. What President Trump said yesterday is in pretty clear tension with what has been his own administration's policy up to this point. Remember, in 2019, President Trump's first administration was the first to break from recognizing Maduro and to lead much of the international community in doing so, and to instead recognize Juan Guaido as the interim president of Venezuela by virtue of his status as the head of the National Assembly. This was a body that was elected in 2015. It represents a lot of the opposition movement and has been hailed as kind of the last valid democratic institution of Venezuela. That really is in tension with this idea now saying, well, we've said all for the last several years, this other group is the legitimate government or the, last legitimate institutional government for the Venezuelan government. But now we're not going to let them run the country. We're going to go essentially to the Maduro regime, sans Maduro, and put them in power. We also have to remember there was an election last year, and Secretary Rubio himself is on the record saying that the surrogate candidate for the opposition leader, Machado, who eventually stood in her place after she was disqualified from the election, won that election. So if you say they've won the election, they are the legitimate winners, then why are they not the people being put in charge of this country? But the Trump administration isn't dealing honestly with that and isn't really providing a clear sense of where it's going in terms of how it sees Venezuela is going to be managed. It's entirely possible it doesn't know itself yet. It's still figuring that out.
The whole world is watching. What message does the events over the last weekend, in your view, send to people like President Xi in our neighbourhood? China has very publicly stated ambitions towards Taiwan. What message does the American action in Venezuela send to somebody like him?
There's a strong element where you can read this message through, or this action through a lot of different lenses. It's possible you read it through an action about saying, well, you read the Trump administration's national security strategy that came out last month, and it really seems to suggest a spheres of influence model, suggesting that China, Russia, and the United States as kind of the three major powers should essentially each get to dominate a degree of sphere of influence and just have to work on balancing each other properly. And you could read that lens to say, well, maybe that means that Russia gets to win in Ukraine more than the Biden administration allowed it, and that China gets to win around Taiwan. At the same time, Russian and Chinese influence in Venezuela was a major factor cited as a reason for this intervention and a reason for opposing Maduro for the last several years, just as that sort of intervention is cited as a reason why U.S. needs greater influence in Greenland and in other contexts. So I'm not sure, again, the administration is being entirely coherent or clear on this. They're very clearly people with very different views winning on different policy fights, and what the underlying strategy is really hard to tell.
Certainly a volatile start to 2026. Scott Anderson, really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
The extraordinary intervention in Venezuela has divided world leaders, some outraged, others delighted. Here at home, the reaction has been relatively quiet, with the Albanese government also under pressure to establish a federal royal commission into the Bondi attack and anti-Semitism. 7:30's political editor Jacob Greber has more.
The first substantive Australian government reaction to Donald Trump's raid on Venezuela.
We've expressed our concerns for some time about the Maduro regime in Venezuela.
With the Treasurer making it clear there are unanswered questions about former President Nicolas Maduro's capture by US forces.
We are supporters of international law, and it's for the Americans to make clear the legal basis of the steps taken over the weekend.
In other words, a cautious, muted response from the government on whether US actions have undermined the rules-based order that Australia endorses. By contrast, the opposition had few qualms.
The human rights abuses, the crushing of freedom and democracy in that country makes it very obvious that Maduro's removal has been a good thing.
The dramatic events in Venezuela have acted as something of a circuit breaker for the Albanese government, which is under pressure over its decision not to establish a federal royal commission into anti-Semitism. With the events of Bondi still raw, calls for such an inquiry have grown in recent days.
Come down off your high horse and stop trying to run for cover. If the Jewish community is calling for a royal commissioner, then do the right thing by this community, and that has suffered enough.
Yesterday, Dawn Fraser joined other prominent sports people calling for a full-blown inquiry, echoing similar demands from business leaders and members of the judiciary. Members of the crossbench are also agitating.
We clearly need to be looking at anti-Semitism, but I think we need to look more broadly at extremism and the kind of motivations behind these sorts of terror attacks. And I think looking into what we've been warned for many years by intelligence agencies is the biggest threat to Australia, is that is homegrown terrorism.
The root of this hatred is radical Islam, and it needs to be addressed. Our social cohesion is fraying. This is not the country that we all know and love. It feels as if it has slipped away, which is why a Commonwealth Royal Commission is so incredibly important.
For now, the government is not budging and has already set up an inquiry into whether security agencies missed signs that could have prevented the December 14th killings. It is also committed to assisting a New South Wales Royal Commission.
That's been the government's focus on what is urgent and what is immediate. We understand, obviously, that there are a number of Australians who would like to see a Commonwealth Royal Commission. We respect those people. We understand that those calls are coming from a good place.
I think we should be using something like a Royal Commission to not only ensure that we are looking at everything that potentially went wrong, what we can do in the future to prevent these sorts of attacks, but also ensure that the community feels like they're being taken seriously.
Despite the push for a Royal Commission, there are opponents.
Royal Commissions have a habit of being extended, they have a habit of branching out.
Prominent criminal defence barrister Robert Richter, a critic of the Israeli government's occupation of the Palestinian territories, last month refused to sign a letter backed by more than 130 senior legal figures calling for a federal royal commission.
If there was to be a bona fide commission, it requires deep thought, deep preparation, deep research.
Free Palestine! One of his key concerns is that the definition of anti-Semitism would be in dispute, including whether criticism of the Israeli government should be included.
It has to be one that allows Jews including non-Zionist Jews, post-Zionist Jews, anti-Zionist Jews, and there are some, there are quite a few. It would have to include those views in order to come to some conclusions about what constitutes anti-Semitism.
Royal commissions are invariably framed by political calculations, but calling one into the Bondi attack is still a possibility, even though it's not currently the government's main game. For now, it's working on tougher hate speech laws, which could be taken to an early sitting of Parliament in the second half of January.
I was expecting that Parliament would have been recalled by now. I think the public expects politicians to drop everything and actually start looking at how do we ensure that we're tightening up the relevant legislation. Is if it's around hate speech, if it's to do with gun control.
I think the important thing here is that we learn the lessons of that horrifying atrocity on the beach and in the park at Bondi. And there are a number of ways to go about that.